Beyond the misty hills of Henley-on-Thames stands a house that feels like a prayer. Stone angels guard its iron gates, ivy climbs the chapel walls, 1,000 roses bloom in silence. This was Friar Park, not just a home, but a sanctuary where George Harrison, the Quiet Beatle, found refuge from fame, from noise, and from the world. Here he gardened, he played, he prayed, and when the time came, he let go, softly, surrounded by the same peace he spent a lifetime searching for. But how did a boy from Liverpool's dusty streets end up here, in this secret garden of soul? Let's walk through the gates and begin. Before the mansions, the millions, and the mysticism, there was Liverpool. And there was a boy named George. He was born not into fame, but into fog, into narrow brick streets, coal fires, and the soft rhythm of a working-class neighborhood trying to rebuild itself after war. George Harrison entered the world on February 25, 1943, the youngest of 4 children in a home filled with laughter, love, and struggle. His mother, Louise, was the first to notice something different. She said he smiled differently when music played, that even in the womb, as she listened to Indian melodies on the radio, sitar, tabla, drones weaving in and out, George would move as if already dancing to a tune the world had yet to hear. Music didn't just entertain him, it awakened him. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the fastest, but when he heard a guitar riff on an Elvis Presley record for the first time, the boy from Liverpool knew instantly this was the language he was born to speak. He became obsessed, quietly, steadily. His father, a bus conductor, noticed this fire and made a choice that would echo through history. He bought George his first guitar. It wasn't cheap, but it was destiny in wood and strings. And soon after, fate would intervene. One day, George boarded a school bus and sat next to another boy with a passion for music, Paul McCartney. They were both shy in their own ways, both hungry for something bigger than the gray rooftops of Liverpool. Paul introduced George to John Lennon, and together they formed the Quarrymen, a skiffle group that would evolve into something unimaginable. They would become the Beatles. But in the beginning, George was the youngest, the quiet one, the observer. While Lennon and McCartney wrote songs and drew attention, Harrison watched and waited, absorbing, learning, growing. It wasn't long before his fingers began speaking for him. As the lead guitarist, his sound became the spine of their evolving identity. But still, in those early years, George's voice, his songwriting, was kept at bay. He brought songs to the group, but they were often met with shrugs. Lennon and McCartney, a towering duo, left little room, and George, always respectful, always patient, waited, until he couldn't anymore. As the 60s unfolded like a Technicolor dream, Harrison began introducing something ancient and unfamiliar into the band's world: India, spirituality, the sitar. He met Ravi Shankar, he studied Hinduism, he traveled inward, while the world chased outward fame. And slowly, the Quiet Beatle began to roar. In 1969, as the Beatles neared their breaking point, Harrison emerged with 2 of the group's most iconic songs, Something and Here Comes the Sun, both written by him, both standing toe-to-toe with anything Lennon or McCartney ever composed. But by then, the band was fracturing. Tension between George and Paul became too much to ignore. The long shadow of Lennon and McCartney's dominance finally pushed George to the edge. He wanted more than just solos and silence. He wanted his voice. When Abbey Road was released in 1969, critics and fans alike were stunned by Harrison's songs. There was elegance in them, depth, a quiet confidence that had waited 10 years to be heard. And just as the world began to see him for who he truly was, the Beatles were no more. In April 1970, Paul McCartney announced the band's breakup. The dream was over. But for George Harrison, the dream was only beginning. Because in the wake of endings, he found something far more lasting than stadiums and screaming crowds. He found solitude, he found faith, and he found a home unlike any other, an enchanted place that would define the rest of his life. Friar Park. When George Harrison first laid eyes on Friar Park, it didn't feel like real estate, it felt like destiny. Perched on a gentle slope in Henley-on-Thames, about 35 miles west of London, the 120-room Victorian Gothic mansion stood like a sleeping cathedral wrapped in vines. Its towers pierced the sky. Its grounds rolled on endlessly, sacred, secret, untouched. The house had once belonged to a wealthy lawyer and eccentric spiritualist named Sir Frank Crisp, but by 1970 it had become a ruin, abandoned, forgotten. The gardens were overgrown, the windows dusty, the fountains dry. But George didn't see decay. He saw resurrection. He purchased the estate for a modest sum, not because he wanted grandeur, but because he needed solitude. A place to plant not just flowers, but ideas. A refuge where fame couldn't follow and silence could speak. And so, Friar Park became more than a house. It became a soulscape. Let's walk through the gates. First, there's the wrought iron archway, twisting leaves forged in black metal, creaking open like a whispered invitation. Gravel crunches beneath your feet as you follow a winding driveway flanked by ancient yews and wild roses. Then, the mansion emerges, stone and ivy, windows like cathedral eyes watching you quietly. Gargoyles perch atop the roof. The main entrance, framed by Gothic carvings, opens into a grand hall where chandeliers hang like stars frozen mid-fall. George kept much of the original architecture intact. He didn't modernize it, he honored it. Inside, each room held its own secret. Carved wood panels, stained glass portraits, velvet drapes soaking in afternoon light. But the magic wasn't just indoors. It was in the gardens. Oh, the gardens. He spent hours tending them, pruning, planting, watering by hand. He didn't hire a fleet of gardeners. He worked the earth himself, in muddy boots and worn gloves, whispering mantras as he trimmed roses and shaped hedges. He even restored the Alpine Rockery, a fantasy landscape of miniature mountains, waterfalls, and bridges, like something from a Tolkien novel. There were artificial caves, subterranean tunnels, and even a replica of the Matterhorn carved into a hill. It wasn't for show. It was for spirit. These gardens weren't status symbols, they were prayers. And somewhere beneath the mansion, in a damp stone basement, George built something sacred, his recording studio. He called it FPSHOT, Friar Park Studio, Henley-on-Thames. It was here that he recorded many of his solo works, collaborating with friends, family, and fellow seekers. And while the world speculated about where the ex-Beatles lived, mansions in LA, penthouses in Manhattan, George Harrison was in a pair of dirty jeans, walking barefoot through moss, chasing butterflies, strumming chords that sounded like rain. He wasn't hiding. He was healing. Friar Park allowed him to be anonymous, even in legend, to meditate without being watched, to raise his son Donnie in a home that felt more like a forest temple than a celebrity fortress. But the estate also had its darkness. In 1999, a deranged man broke in and stabbed George repeatedly. It was here, within the very walls meant to protect him, that he came closest to death years before his body would finally give in to cancer. Yet even after that night, George chose to stay. Because this was more than bricks and soil. It was a sanctuary of the soul. And from within these stone walls and sacred gardens, George would build not just music, but a new kind of legacy, one rooted in faith, truth, and a refusal to be anything but his most authentic self. The Beatles ended with silence, not an explosion, not a curtain call, just a quiet unraveling of something the world thought would never fall apart. But for George Harrison, that silence wasn't the end. It was the beginning. When Abbey Road marked the Beatles' final collective breath, George, long overshadowed, finally had the space to speak with his own voice. And what a voice it was. In 1970, just months after the band's breakup, he released All Things Must Pass. It wasn't just an album, it was a release, a triple LP, a rarity in the music world that poured out years of songs held back, tucked away, overlooked. Songs filled with longing, grace, and a yearning that only comes from watching your best years drift by in someone else's spotlight. Critics called it a revelation, listeners called it healing. The album's lead single, My Sweet Lord, echoed like a prayer across the airwaves, a chant of devotion, blending Hindu mantras with Western melodies and reminding the world that spirituality could exist in harmony with pop. It wasn't about religion, it was about the soul. And that became George Harrison's true compass from that point forward. He didn't chase hits, he chased meaning. In 1973, Living in the Material World followed, less commercial, but more personal. It was a meditation set to music, filled with themes of karma, detachment, and spiritual awakening. While his fellow Beatles pursued fame, fashion, and firestorms, George turned inward. And he invited the world to come with him, not to follow him, but to walk beside him. Yet, even the quietest Beatle had an edge, and that edge came alive in film. In the late 70s, when a controversial script from a ragtag group of British comedians was dropped by its backers, George stepped in. The movie? Monty Python's Life of Brian. He mortgaged Friar Park, his sanctuary, to fund the project. When asked why, he simply said, "Because I wanted to see the movie." It was the most expensive movie ticket in history, but it worked. Life of Brian became a cult classic, bold, irreverent, and beloved. And George Harrison became not just a rock legend, but a visionary producer. From there, he co-founded Handmade Films, a production company that would go on to deliver critical and commercial successes like Time Bandits, With Nail and I, and Shanghai Surprise. These weren't safe studio projects. They were odd, brave, British, just like him. But with art comes risk. And sometimes, risk invites betrayal. By the late 1980s, Handmade Films was in financial trouble. George discovered that his trusted business partner, Dennis O'Brien, had been mismanaging the company's finances, leaving him with enormous personal debt. The man he had trusted with his company had nearly drained his fortune, so George sued him. The case dragged on for years, but in 1996, justice arrived. A judge awarded George $11.6 million in damages. Yet even in victory, George didn't gloat. He didn't lash out in interviews or feed the headlines. He returned to the garden. He picked up his rake, not his ego, because to him, money lost could be earned again. But peace? Peace had to be grown, moment by moment. In the 1990s, he returned to music with Quiet Power, contributing to the Traveling Wilburys, a supergroup of kindred souls including Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne. They weren't chasing trends, they were chasing joy, and in each note, you could hear George smiling. But as the decade wore on, the air began to shift. His voice grew softer, his public appearances fewer. There were whispers of illness, but little was confirmed. George didn't want the spotlight. He wanted to disappear into the leaves. And yet, even as his health waned and fame faded, George Harrison's wealth remained. But true to his nature, it wasn't just about numbers. It was about what that wealth allowed him to build and to give. He never flashed diamonds. He never bragged about bank accounts. But behind the ivy-covered walls of Friar Park, George Harrison quietly amassed a fortune that spoke not through opulence, but through intention. At the peak of his career with the Beatles, George was already one of the wealthiest musicians on the planet. But unlike the headlines that surrounded Lennon or McCartney, Harrison's riches grew in silence. In 1980, a financial analysis estimated his net worth at $100 million, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to over $300 million today. Even then, it placed him ahead of Ringo Starr and just behind John Lennon. But George didn't measure his life in numbers, he measured it in meaning. And yet, money did come, steadily, quietly. Music royalties remained a major source of income. Despite being allowed fewer tracks on Beatles albums, his songwriting contributions, like Something, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and Here Comes the Sun, became timeless treasures. These tracks alone generated millions in performance rights and publishing revenue year after year. Then came his solo career, with albums like All Things Must Pass and Living in the Material World, both multi-platinum successes. My Sweet Lord became a global hit, topping charts and selling millions. And long after his passing, these songs continued to earn. But perhaps one of the most unexpected financial pillars of his life was handmade films. While its ultimate demise was painful, there was a time when the company flourished. Films like Time Bandits and Life of Brian brought in tens of millions in box office revenue, much of which flowed back into Harrison's estate. And even when losses came, when betrayal struck, George turned those moments into lessons, not lawsuits for revenge. The $11.6 million he won in court against his former business manager? He never flaunted it. He simply used it to restore what had been taken. But wealth for George was never about accumulation. It was about freedom. It gave him the space to turn Friar Park into a sanctuary of art and faith. It gave him the resources to build a home studio where creativity could bloom without deadlines. It gave him the ability to say no, to decline fame, to retreat from the public eye, to spend his hours pruning roses rather than attending red carpets. And in the end, it gave him peace of mind. And George didn't just use his wealth to preserve gardens or melodies. He used it to serve, to lift others, to reach places even his songs could not. Let's now step into the part of his life that mattered most to him: giving back, philanthropy. He never called himself a savior, never needed a spotlight to do good. But behind the garden gates of Friar Park, George Harrison planted more than roses. He planted hope. It began, perhaps, with heartbreak. In 1971, his friend and mentor Ravi Shankar came to him, troubled, broken-hearted over the tragedy unfolding in his homeland. Bangladesh had just been ravaged by a cyclone, and war had left millions homeless, starving, voiceless. Shankar didn't ask for much, he just wanted to help. George didn't hesitate. He picked up his guitar, called a few friends, and organized the Concert for Bangladesh, a groundbreaking event that would forever change how the world saw music and philanthropy. On August 1st, 1971, Madison Square Garden filled with thousands. Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, all answered George's call. Together, they raised over $240,000 that night. But that was only the beginning. Through album and film releases, the movement would go on to generate more than $13 million for refugees, though bureaucratic entanglements with the IRS delayed much of the funds. Still, it stood as a beacon. It was the first major benefit concert of its kind, years before Live Aid, years before Farm Aid. George was first. Because to him, music wasn't just a form of expression, it was a form of service. And Bangladesh wasn't an isolated act of charity. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, George became a passionate supporter of environmental causes. He donated to Greenpeace, backed the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and stood against nuclear energy alongside Friends of the Earth. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't wear causes on t-shirts or shout in interviews. He simply gave his voice, gave his money, gave his name when it mattered most. In the early 1990s, after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, the world turned its eyes to the tragedy unfolding in Romania. Thousands of children were abandoned in orphanages, sick, starved, forgotten. George's wife, Olivia, created the Romanian Angel Appeal Foundation, and once again, George answered the call. He didn't just cut a check, he picked up his guitar. Alongside his supergroup, the Traveling Wilburys, George recorded the charity single, Nobody's Child. He also helped assemble a full fundraising album featuring legends like Eric Clapton, Elton John, Stevie Wonder, and Van Morrison. He gathered souls through sound, because that's what he did best. Even after his death, the seeds of generosity kept blooming. In 2007, his family established the George Harrison Fund for UNICEF, continuing his mission to protect children caught in crisis. The fund donated $450,000 to victims of Cyclone Cedar in Bangladesh that same year, completing a circle George had begun decades earlier. In 2009, the first George Harrison Humanitarian Award was given to Ravi Shankar, an honor not just of friendship, but of shared purpose. George didn't build schools with his name on the wall. He didn't pose with oversized checks. He simply asked, "What can I do?" And then he did it, not for applause, but because compassion was his religion and giving was his practice. And while the world knew George Harrison as a musician, a Beatle, a legend, those closest to him knew a gentler truth. He was a father, a husband, a man who watered his plants and whispered mantras, personal life. At the heart of Friar Park, amid the roses and the silence, lived a man who had once been chased by millions. But here, there were no crowds, only peace, and two people who mattered most. George Harrison met Olivia Trinidad Arias in 1974, not on a red carpet, not through fame, but through music. She worked as a marketing executive at A&M Records, quiet, focused, grounded. Their love didn't explode into headlines. It unfolded gently, like a flower in the garden George had long dreamed of planting. They married in 1978. That same year, their son Donnie was born, a quiet boy with his father's dark hair and searching eyes. George loved being a father, not in the Hollywood sense, with photo ops and press interviews, but in the way he brewed tea every morning, tended to the garden with Donnie by his side, and played chords to lull him to sleep. They were a trio, bound not by fame, but by faith, simplicity, and deep affection. George's days at Friar Park were sacred routines. He'd wake before dawn, meditate in the sunroom, then walk through the gardens barefoot. He studied the Bhagavad Gita, played ukulele under old oaks, and spoke softly to the koi fish in the pond. He didn't need the stage anymore. His stage was now the earth, his applause, the rustling of leaves. And yet life, however spiritual, does not spare anyone its trials. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer. He underwent radiotherapy, and for a while, things looked promising. But fate had another test in store. In December 1999, a man broke into Friar Park. Armed with a kitchen knife, he stabbed George over 40 times. Bloodied and gasping for breath, George still found the strength to fight back. Olivia, too, leapt to his defense, striking the intruder with a lamp. The scene was horrific, like something torn from a nightmare, unfolding in the one place George thought he was safe. Surgeons removed part of his lung. Scars, both physical and emotional, remained. But George stayed. Because Friar Park wasn't just walls and windows, it was sacred ground. In the years that followed, cancer returned, this time to his brain and lungs. But George didn't rage. He didn't fear. Instead, he accepted. He spent more time with Donnie, laughing over old guitars and silly jokes. He watched the garden change through the seasons, noticing each new bloom like it was a miracle. He whispered chants. He forgave what needed forgiving. In November 2001, as the world entered winter, George Harrison let go. He passed away at the Los Angeles home of his friend Paul McCartney, surrounded by Olivia, Donnie, and the soft hum of mantras. At the moment of death, incense burned and spiritual guides were present. George's final words, according to Olivia, were, "Love one another." Not a performance, not a goodbye, just a whisper, a truth, and perhaps a final instruction to us all. If it made you pause, reflect, maybe even smile through a tear, then don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs quiet today, and subscribe to join us on more journeys into the lives and legacies that shaped our world. After all things must pass, but some things, some souls, are simply eternal.